This is Harsh Rules. I'm Ben Harsh, and today we're going to learn to play Axis and Allies Global 1940. Axis and Allies Global 1940 is a combination of Axis and Allies Pacific 1940 and Axis and Allies Europe 1940. The second edition of these games was published in 2012 by Avalon Hill and designed by Larry Harris Jr. Collectively, these games take 6+ hours to play. This is the third and final tutorial in our Axis and Allies 1940 series. In Part 1, we covered off on Pacific 1940. In Part 2, we covered off on Europe 1940. Now we're going to look at the rules for combining both games in what is known as the Global Edition. This third and final tutorial will contain all information from the previous two games as well as rules specific to the Global Edition, so you should only need to refer to this episode to understand how to play. The rules for Europe and Pacific 1940 are fully covered in the first two tutorials in the series. So if you only have one of these board games, you can refer back to those episodes for rules specific to that version. So with all that said, let's now jump in and learn how to play Axis and Allies Global 1940. Let's begin with an overview of the game and how to set it all up. This is the combined game boards of Axis and Allies Pacific and Europe 1940. When combining all 4 game boards from both games, you then have the Global Edition of the game. Now I'm going to cover these boards with some garish colors to better illustrate the national boundaries. The game board is divided into territory and sea zone spaces. The color of a particular territory or an island in a sea zone represents a nation's forces controlling that area. Most territories contain an industrial production value represented by a circled number in the space. When a nation conquers one of their opponent's territories, they gain this numbered amount of industrial power. Likewise, the defeated opponent loses this amount in industrial power. The emblem printed on each territory designates the original nation that controls it at the beginning of the game. When another nation takes control of that territory, they communicate this ownership by placing a control marker. A control marker is also used to track that nation's total industrial points on the industrial production chart. Whenever a nation gains or loses territories, they update their status on this chart. At the end of a player's turn, they receive Industrial Production Certificates, or IPCs, the game's currency, equal to their ranking on the chart. Be aware, this version of Axis and Allies does not come with currency. The game asks you to record this on a sheet of paper. However, many players use currency from other games or even poker chips to keep track of their currency. Currency the player earns is used to purchase more military units to defend existing territories and conquer the opponent's territories. This triangular model forms the core of Axis and Allies area control gameplay. To win the game, the Axis or the Allies must control a set number of victory cities marked in red on the map. For the Axis to win the game, they must control 8 victory cities on the Europe half of the map or 6 victory cities on the Pacific side of the map for a full round of play. For the Allies to win the game, they must control Berlin, Rome, and Tokyo for a complete round of play. And during this period, they must retain control of at least one Allied capital of Washington, London, Paris, or Moscow. You may have also noticed that there are other colored regions on the map than the playable nations. The Sahara Desert in Africa and the Pripyat Marshes in Russia are considered impassable, and I've marked them on the map in magenta. Although Canada is called out with its own symbol and territories on the board, they have a strict allegiance to the United Kingdom. The United Kingdom places their units in these territories and collect any industrial points from them. The white territories are considered neutral territories. Unlike previous Axis and Allies games where players are prohibited from entering, in the 1940 series, neutral powers can be entered. However, whichever side enters a neutral territory is considered an act of war against it. That territory will then join the opposing side and raise a standing army to resist the invaders. The number of infantry units that form the standing army is dictated by the soldier icon in the territory. The number next to the soldier icon indicates the number of infantry units to place in that territory. The political situation of the remaining nations and how they relate to the major powers we will cover off on next. The Axis and Allies 1940 series has a complex political landscape that parallels actual history. When the war begins, Germany and Italy are at war with the United Kingdom, the Anzac, and France. The Dutch, a non-playable minor power, has had their capital captured by Germany and its territories must be liberated. France itself is in a precarious position, and it's now only a matter of time before that nation falls under Germany's control as well. Meanwhile, in the Pacific theater, Japan is only at war with China. The remainder of the playable nations, the United States and the Soviet Union, have remained neutral up to this point. The US has a strict policy of isolationism and is considered neutral. The Soviet Union is also considered neutral, having signed a treaty with Germany. Unprovoked, the US will remain out of the war until the end of Round 3, and the Soviet Union will remain out of the war until Round 4. However, these powers will enter the war early if attacked by an Axis power or London falls. With the national powers involved in the Pacific theater, all nations except China must still formally enter the war against Japan. All over the globe, each nation will need to manage the political situation to find the best opportunity to enter the war or provoke other nations into the conflict. Now that we have reviewed all the major powers' current position on the war, let's review the smaller neutral powers' stance on the conflict. Neutral powers are much more sophisticated in the 1940 series than in previous Axis and Allies games. In the Europe version of the game, neutral powers are divided into 3 types. Strict neutrals are the most numerous. These nations have no sympathies to either side. Therefore, entering one of these strict neutral nations is considered a combat move. When invaded, that nation will then shift to full sympathy with the opposite side of the conflict. Also, many of these nations have standing armies, so be very careful when entering a strict neutral. On the political spectrum, there are also neutrals that have existing sympathies to either the Axis or the Allied powers. Neutrals with sympathy to a particular side are considered friendly neutrals. And obviously, if a neutral is friendly to the opposite side, they become unfriendly neutrals. Neutral territories with sympathies to a particular nation can only be entered as a non-combat move. Also, air units cannot fly over them to the next territory. They can only fly into that territory. When the nation that the neutral has sympathies for enters the territory, they place their control marker and gain any industrial points available. That neutral power has just joined the war on that nation's side. Unfriendly or strict neutrals must be entered as a combat move. Air units cannot fly over them to the next territory. These neutrals must be taken by force to gain the industrial points. Just remember that strict neutrals will align with the opposite side once they're invaded. Unfriendly neutrals never change their allegiance. Now back at the game board, let's consider all the political ramifications of what we've just learned. Because our next step is for each player to collect their nation's supply boxes and begin placing units on the board. Let's take a look. Each player will receive at least 1 and sometimes 2 supply boxes filled with their nation's military units. These are the Allied supply boxes, 2 for the United Kingdom, 2 for the United States with France, China, the Soviet Union, and the Anzac. And these are the Axis supply boxes for Germany, Italy, and Japan. Each supply box contains a set number of land, air, and sea military units. While the number of units between nations varies slightly, with the exception of China that has only infantry units, all nations have the same units you see here represented. Following the guide on the box lid, place the listed amount of each unit in the specified territory. To maximize the amount of units available and to reduce board clutter, it is recommended that you use the included chips. You place chips beneath a figure to specify a number of additional units of the same type. The figure on top identifies the units represented by the stack and counts as one unit. Each gray chip represents one additional unit. Green chips represent 3 additional units, and red chips indicate 5 additional units. Once you've placed all the units listed on the various box lids, there are some additional units that must be placed for the global edition. To complete the setup for the Soviet Union, place 6 Soviet infantry in Amur, 6 Soviet infantry in Sakha, and 6 Soviet infantry in Buryatia. To complete the setup for the Anzac, place 2 Anzac infantry in Egypt and remove 1 UK infantry. When these units are placed, the board is set up and now ready to play. In the global edition of the game, the starting currency also varies from what is printed on top of the supply boxes. In particular, the United Kingdom is unique in that they have a dual economy. The Europe half of the board is tracked on the industrial chart with the UK control marker, and the Pacific Theater side of the board is tracked with the Union Jack control marker. The Europe economy includes all the territories controlled by the United Kingdom on the Europe side of the map, and London is the regional capital. The Pacific economy includes all the territories controlled by the United Kingdom on the Pacific side of the map. Calcutta is its regional capital. There are 2 exceptions to this regional division. West India on the Europe map is part of the Pacific economy, and the North American territories on the Pacific map are part of the Europe economy. The UK player must keep all this in mind when tracking their dual economy. Furthermore, in the global edition, the United Kingdom manages its economies and finances on the Europe side of the board and the Pacific side of the board separately. The capital of the Europe side is London. The Pacific side is Calcutta. If either of these regional capitals is captured, it only affects one side of the board for the United Kingdom. Likewise, capturing Berlin or Rome benefits the Europe side of the UK. Capturing Tokyo benefits the Pacific side. Keep these rules for the global edition in mind, as it requires a player to manage the United Kingdom as almost 2 separate nations. Now that the board is set up, let's take a look at the phases of gameplay. The Axis and Allies Global 1940 game follows a set order of play for each game round. The first player is Germany, followed by the Soviet Union, then Japan. After that, the United States, then China, the United Kingdom, Italy, the Anzac, and finally, France. The nations of China and France are not large enough to sustain one player. Therefore, the Allied players will need to elect 2 of their ranks to fulfill these roles during the game. Each player's turn is comprised of 7 phases. In Phase 1, a player may spend IPCs to conduct research and development. Upon the successful roll of a die, they may be able to employ new technology on the battlefield. In Phase 2, the player will purchase new units and repair any damaged units. Newly purchased units are placed in the mobilization zone and will not be available until Phase 6. In Phase 3, the player moves their units into attack positions within enemy territories. Also during this phase, players may declare war against other nations. In Phase 4, combat is conducted and any territories that are lost or gained update the national production chart. In Phase 5, players make non-combat moves to reinforce their positions or to move units if they're not at war. In Phase 6, new units are removed from the mobilization zones and placed on the game board. Finally, in Phase 7, players check the national production chart and collect the appropriate amount of IPCs based on the territories they now control. Be aware, the amount of IPCs collected may be impacted by national objectives and convoy disruption. Also, at the end of the turn, it may be necessary to check victory conditions. If the current player has just met the victory conditions for their side, that side must maintain control of that position until the end of this turn in the next round of play. If they are successful in doing this, they've won the game. Next, we're going to look at each of these game phases in greater detail. In the first phase of a player's turn, it's time to conduct research and development. Research and development can be completed in up to 4 steps. In the first step, players purchase researcher dice for 5 IPCs each. In Step 2, the player rolls each of the research dice that they've purchased. If the roll is 5 or less, the researchers fail to make a scientific breakthrough. However, if the die roll is a 6, a scientific breakthrough is made. The player will then proceed to Step 3, rolling the breakthrough dice and see what they've discovered. The player can then decide which breakthrough chart he or she wants to roll a die on to see which scientific breakthrough they made. If the player chooses breakthrough chart 1 and rolls a dice, if they roll a 1, they discover advanced artillery. With advanced artillery, 1 artillery unit can now support 2 infantry units, which raises the infantry's attack to 2. If a 2 is rolled, rockets are discovered. An airbase may now fire 1 rocket at an enemy industrial complex, airbase, or naval base within 4 spaces. This attack does 1 die roll worth of damage to that facility. Rockets may not be fired over neutral territories. If a 3 is rolled, then the paratrooper ability is enabled. With the paratrooper ability, up to 2 infantry units in the same territory as an air base can be redeployed up to 3 spaces away to support an attack or an amphibious assault. When moving, paratroopers must obey the same restrictions that air units do. If the territory being attacked has an AAA gun, the paratrooper infantry units are subject to anti-aircraft fire in the same way as air units. If attacking along with land units from adjacent territories, paratroopers may also retreat as normal. A roll of 4 increases factory production. With increased factory production, industrial complexes can now produce additional units. Major industrial complexes can produce 12 units, minor industrial complexes can produce 4 units. Also, 1 IPC now removes 2 damage markers. A roll of 5 enables war bonds. With war bonds, a player can roll a 6-sided dice per turn and receive that many IPCs. With a roll of 6, mechanized infantry is activated. With improved mechanized infantry, they can now blitz on their own. Also, when paired with a tank or an artillery unit, their attack rating is increased to 2. Now let's look at the discoveries on Breakthrough Chart 2. On a roll of 1, super submarines are discovered. The super submarine discovery increases a submarine's attack to 3. On a roll of 2, jet fighters are discovered. With jet fighter technology, fighters now attack on a 4. On a roll of 3, improved shipyards are put into place. Improved shipyards create an efficiency price cut on all naval units. On a roll of 4, radar is discovered. Radar increases an anti-aircraft gun's defense to 2. On a roll of 5, long-range aircraft are unlocked. With long-range aircraft, the range of each air unit is increased by 1. And finally, on a roll of 6, heavy bombers are discovered. Heavy bombers can conduct strategic bombing raids with 2 dice. When a new breakthrough is discovered, players place one of their control markers on the technology space on the breakthrough chart. Other players can discover the same technology, but technologies cannot be shared amongst players. Now let's look at Phase 2, Purchase and Repair Units. During this phase, players spend IPCs to purchase units that will be deployed later in the turn. This graph shows each unit's expense in land and air categories. And on this page, the graph shows the expense for naval units. The 1940 series also introduces the Facilities unit type. Facilities units include industrial complexes, air bases, and naval bases. Industrial complexes are used to produce air, land, and sea units and come in major and minor varieties. Minor industrial complexes can produce 3 units per turn. Major industrial complexes can produce 10 units per turn. An industrial complex produces 1 less unit for each point of damage received from strategic bombing raids. Air bases can extend the range of aircraft stationed nearby by 1. Air units can also be scrambled to provide defense to an adjacent territory or sea zone space. An airbase becomes inoperable if suffering 3 points of damage from a tactical bombing raid. Naval bases can extend the range of naval units within the vicinity by 1. They can also be used to repair capital ships. Their range of services are 1 adjacent space from their location, and they become inoperable if suffering 3 points of damage from a tactical bombing raid. Keep these facility abilities and their vulnerabilities to certain types of bombers in mind as you plan out your strategy. Once units are purchased, they are placed in the mobilization zone. The mobilization zone is located here on the lower right-hand corner of the game board. This section of the board also provides a reminder of the cost of individual units. This is the mobilization zone for the Europe side of the board. The Pacific side of the board also has its own mobilization zone. During this game phase, a player may also repair any damaged capital ships or pay IPCs to repair damaged facilities. Capital ships include aircraft carriers and battleships, and they require 2 hits to destroy. A capital ship that suffers 1 hit is considered damaged. Damaged units are tracked by placing the figure on its side. If a capital ship makes it to friendly waters within range of that nation's naval base, they may be repaired to full strength at no cost. As we saw just a moment earlier, facilities may take damage from strategic and tactical bombing raids. We'll cover off on conducting these raids during the combat phase. Repairs from those attacks are completed in this phase. To repair damaged facilities, the player must pay 1 IPC per point of inflicted damage. Next, in Phase 3, the player will conduct their combat moves. The combat move phase is meant to position attacking units in hostile territories, where combat will be conducted in the next phase. If a player's nation is not currently at war, they cannot move any of their units during this phase. Nations not at war make all their moves during the non-combat phase. The only unit that cannot move regardless during this phase are AAA guns that can only move during the non-combat phase. Other than that exception, the movement rules themselves are fairly straightforward. Land units can either move 1 or 2 territories per turn. Air units such as tactical bombers and fighters can fly over 4 territory or sea zones, while strategic bombers have a range of 6. With the aid of an air base, all air unit ranges are increased by 1. Be aware that air units must divide their movement between the combat move and the non-combat move phases. At the end of the non-combat moves phase, they must be able to land in friendly territory. Finally, naval units all can move 2 sea zones per turn. With the aid of a sea base, their range is extended to 3. Before we get into specific transit rules, let's talk about the rules in effect when a nation is not formally at war with another power. For naval movement, ships not at war do not block the naval units of other powers and vice versa. They can occupy the same sea zones. A power not at war cannot attack a territory controlled by or containing units belonging to a power which it is not at war with. A power not at war may not move land or air units into neutral territories. They may not move land or air units into territories or onto ships from other nations, and they also may not use another nation's resources, such as bases and transports. Keep these restrictions in mind when a nation is not at a state of war with another power. To change non-war status, obviously, a nation needs to declare war on another nation. However, be aware, a nation must declare war against each individual member of an alliance, whether they're the Axis or the Allies. For example, a nation may declare war on Germany, but still not be at war yet with Italy. In most cases, war is declared on another nation at the beginning of the combat phase. Now, with that out of the way, let's talk about the transit rules for each zone, starting with land units. Transit rules can be divided into 2 groups: permitted moves and prohibited moves. Starting with permitted land movements, obviously the first is the combat move. In a combat move, land units enter a hostile territory, and this triggers combat in the next phase. Players can also conduct a capture move. With this maneuver, a player moves his forces into an undefended territory and takes it over. Similar to the capture move, tanks can conduct a blitz maneuver. When conducting a blitz, tanks move into an undefended territory, capture it, and then blitz to an adjacent territory. The territory can be hostile or friendly. A tank can even turn around and blitz back into the territory he started from. Mechanized units paired with a tank can conduct the blitz maneuver with them as well. Now let's look at some prohibited moves for land units. Anti-aircraft guns have a limited move. They can only move during the non-combat moves phase. Sea transit rules are slightly more complicated because sea zones can be divided into surface and submerged areas. First, let's look at the permitted moves for sea transit. Once again, naval units entering a hostile sea zone constitutes a combat move that may be resolved in the next phase. However, if the sea zone only contains submarines and transports, then the player moving in can choose to ignore conflict and proceed to the next sea zone. Submarines can submerge themselves and enter or pass through hostile sea zones. However, if a submarine enters a sea zone with a destroyer, they must stop and cannot move any farther. While we're talking about movement, let's cover off on the transport. Transports cannot conduct combat and are primarily used to transport land units. A transport has cargo space for 1 infantry unit and either a 2nd infantry unit or one of the following: a tank, an AAA gun, an artillery unit, or a mechanized infantry unit. Some additional rules regarding transports. In naval combat, they are always the last unit removed. They can be used cooperatively to transport units from nations on the same side of the conflict. Transports can also be used in coordinated naval landings called amphibious assaults. We'll cover off on amphibious assaults in the combat phase. Finally, let's look at the air transit rules. Like land and sea units, air units can proceed into hostile territory as a combat move, and the conflict will be resolved in the next phase. Air units are unique in that they can travel over land or sea zones. However, air units must plan their movements from the combat move phase to the non-combat move phase. This is to ensure that the plane can land in friendly territory. The etiquette for this is to announce a sort of flight plan. A player must declare an existing friendly destination for his planes to land prior to launching the trip. A player cannot declare a destination that is currently hostile and hope the upcoming combat phase will make it friendly. Be aware that aircraft making a combat move is subject to anti-aircraft fire. In my own games, I house rule this to include flyovers as well, but the actual rules state otherwise. It's Phase 4. It's now time to conduct combat. In combat, each unit has skills as either an attacker or defender. When a 6-sided die is rolled, a hit is scored if that unit rolls their attack or defense rating or less. Some units perform better as defenders rather than attackers, and vice versa. Some units have no attack or defense rating, like transports, or only can defend, like the AAA gun. In this chart, each unit is represented with the attack rating on the left in red and the defense rating on the right in black. As you can see, a roll of 5 or 6 for either rating is considered a miss. This chart shows how units can be paired in combined arms to gain a new ability for one of the units. Infantry or mechanized infantry can be paired with an artillery unit to increase their attack rating to 2. Mechanized infantry can also be paired with a tank to enable them to blitz. Tactical bombers can be paired with a tank or a fighter to increase their attack rating to 4. And any aircraft can be paired with a destroyer to allow the air unit to hit submarines. Keep these pairings in mind and communicate your paired bonuses to the other player when conducting battles. Once a player has made all their combat moves into hostile territories or sea zones, it's time to resolve each one of those conflicts through combat. To conduct combat, you will need the combat strip and the casualty zone strip. Each conflict is resolved in 6 combat steps which comprise a combat round. The first step is to place units along the combat strip. Attacking units are placed on the upper half of the strip, in the zone with their icon. Defending units are placed on the lower half of the strip, in that section with their icon. The center of the strip reminds players the die roll or less they need for that unit type to score a hit. The second step is for pre-battle attacks and are broken into 2 parts. The first part, which we will call 2A, occurs if the attacker has aircraft and the defender has AAA guns. Each AAA gun in the conflict can fire at up to 3 aircraft. On a die roll of 1, they score a hit and the aircraft is immediately destroyed. Step A only occurs once at the beginning of the battle, then players skip this step for the remainder of the conflict. Step 2B only occurs in sea zone battles with submarines present on either the attacker or the defender's side. If no enemy destroyers are present, a submarine can conduct a surprise strike. This allows the submarine to roll a die and attempt to score a hit before the main exchange between forces begin. Each submarine unit also has the option of, instead of conducting a surprise strike, they can elect to submerge and immediately be removed from the battle. In Step 3, attacking units get to fire first. Let's play through this short mini-battle to show you how this works. In this example, we have the attacking US player with a tank and an infantry unit. The US player is going to roll a die for each unit. First, he rolls for the tank, and he rolls a 4, which is a miss. Next, he rolls for the infantry unit and rolls a 1, which is a hit. When the attacker scores a hit, the defender gets to choose which of his units will be the casualty. The defender chooses his infantry unit and moves that unit behind the casualty strip. In the next step, the defender gets to fire back. A key point to remember in this battle is that both sides are conducting combat simultaneously. The casualty strip is only used by the defender to keep track of casualties who get one last chance to roll a die and try to score a hit before they're removed from the battle. Therefore, the infantry unit still gets one last die roll. The defender rolls for his tank and rolls a 2, which is a hit. He then rolls for his dying infantryman, and he rolls a 1, which is also a hit. The American player also gets to select his own casualties, but since there are 2 hits and only 2 units, all his units are eliminated regardless. In the next step, the defender removes his infantry unit casualty from the battle. Now, technically the battle is over, but let's walk through this last step. If the battle continued, the attacker would have to choose. The attacker could press the attack, and this would kick off another round of combat. This cycle would continue until either a retreat is declared or the units on one side are eliminated and a victor is declared. The attacker can also choose to retreat out of the territory and end the battle. Just remember, if the territory changes owners, to update the industrial chart for both sides. The 1940 series has 2 types of bombing raids. Strategic bombing raids are used to weaken the unit production capabilities of industrial complexes. These bombing raids can only be conducted by strategic bombers. Tactical bombing raids are used to knock out naval base and air base special abilities. These raids can be conducted by either type of bomber. Raiding groups can be comprised of bombers and fighter escorts. However, a raid is considered a combat move and all air units involved cannot participate in any other combat during the turn. Bombing raids are conducted in 4 steps. In step 1, the raiders proceed to the targeted facility. If the defender's territory has fighters, they can engage the raiding fighters and bombers. Combat is similar to normal combat except that it lasts only 1 round and all engaged units have an attack and a defense value of 1. In step 2, fighter escorts withdraw but remain in the same territory. They can be flown back during the non-combat move phase. Bombers must then evade the facility's defense system. Contrary to all logic, AAA guns cannot shoot at the raiders during this phase. Instead, each facility has a built-in defense system. The defending player rolls 1 die for each bomber attacking the facility. On a roll of 1, the facility scores a hit, and a bomber of the attacker's choice is destroyed. In step 3, the bombers can finally do their work, and they get to roll 1 die each. That die result indicates the number of damage markers, you use gray chips, placed beneath the industrial complex. Each damage marker reduces the industrial complex production output of new units by 1. An air base or naval base that sustains 3 damage markers is considered disabled. Each strategic bomber gets to modify its die result with a +2. Major industrial complexes can be damaged up to 20 points. Minor industrial complexes can be damaged up to 6 points. Industrial complexes must be repaired back to their original production range to start producing units again. Air bases and naval bases stop providing their services at 3 points of damage, but can be bombed all the way to 6 points. Restoring base services would require the facility to be repaired back to at least 2 points of damage. Step 4 takes place during the non-combat phase and is simply moving the surviving bombers and fighters back to friendly territory. Next, let's talk about the coordinated action known as the amphibious assault. The amphibious assault may take up to 3 stages of combat to complete. The first stage is the sea battle. The second stage is offshore bombardment, but this only occurs if there was no sea battle. And third and finally is the landing and the assault. Sea battles occur when there is a hostile sea zone with enemy ships and planes. During this stage, transports cannot attack during the battle, but they can be chosen last as casualties. If the attacker has air units involved, they must make a choice. The attacker's air units can participate in the sea battle phase or the landing and assault phase. They cannot fight in both. If a sea battle doesn't occur, any battleships or cruisers involved can conduct an offshore bombardment. This is a one-time attack against units on the targeted territory. Finally, in the third stage, transports land on the beaches and unload their cargo. At this point, a traditional land battle begins. The land units can then get support from any air units that did not participate in a sea battle. Kamikaze strikes are a unique defense only available to the Japanese player. Historically, this was a Japanese pilot that conducted a suicide attack on enemy ships with a plane loaded with explosives. In this game, the Japanese player is only allowed 6 kamikaze defense strikes in the sea zones highlighted on the board. Each eligible sea zone will be marked with the kamikaze icon. This maneuver may only be executed if an allied player is conducting an attack or an amphibious assault in the marked sea zones. Prior to the battle, the Japanese player will declare they are conducting a kamikaze strike. They then spend a kamikaze token, or tokens if multiple strikes are planned, and indicate which ship or ships are being targeted. Submarines and transports cannot be targeted. The Japanese player will then roll 1 die for each strike. A roll of 2 or less is considered a hit. Some additional notes on this maneuver. During an amphibious assault, a kamikaze strike is considered a sea battle, and this prevents offshore bombardment. Also remember that capital ships still require 2 hits to destroy. Capital ships can be targeted with multiple kamikaze strikes. Once combat is concluded, it's time to make non-combat moves to reinforce positions. Non-combat moves are primarily used to reinforce territories and involve moving units from one friendly territory or sea zone to another. If an allied nation is not formally at war with Japan, they move all their units during this phase. Naval units not at war do not block other sea units and vice versa. They can occupy the same sea zones. Also unique to this phase is that the anti-aircraft gun can now be moved as well. All combat moves should have been completed previously and are now considered prohibited during this phase. In Phase 6, it's time to take those new units in the mobilization zone and get them on the board. A quick reminder, new units purchased earlier in the player turn were placed in the mobilization zone. This phase is all about getting those units on the board. Units can only be produced by industrial complexes. Land and air units are placed in the territory with the industrial complex. Naval units are placed in adjacent sea zones. Each industrial complex is limited to the number of units it can produce per turn. Also remember to check for any damage markers beneath the complex that would reduce unit output. And finally, it's Phase 7, time to check the national production chart and collect IPCs. In this phase, players will review the national production chart and collect the amount of IPCs equal to their current ranking. However, be aware there are a number of factors that can impact the amount of income that you collect. One of the unique aspects of the deluxe Axis and Allies games is they offer players bonus income if they successfully roleplay a nation's objectives during World War II. Bonus IPCs are awarded if a player or alliance controls specific territories on their collect income phase. The national objectives listed here are for the Europe side of the map. Germany is unique in that they receive bonus IPCs for not being at war with the Soviet Union. This provides an additional incentive to Germany to stay out of the war as long as possible with the Soviet Union. All other nations must be at war to fulfill national objectives and gain IPCs. France is also a unique situation in that when it's liberated, the player that liberates it gets to place 12 IPC worth of French units. Keep this in mind when a player liberates France. And this is the national objectives for the Pacific side of the map. Notice that Japan also receives bonus IPCs when not at war with the US. The remainder of the nations involved in the Pacific theater only receive IPC bonuses if they are at war. During this phase, players may also be subject to convoy disruption. If the current player controls territory adjacent to a sea zone with the convoy symbol, they may become victim to convoy disruption if that sea zone only contains at least one enemy vessel. For each enemy battleship, cruiser, and/or destroyer, that player rolls 1 die. For each submarine and aircraft launched from a carrier in the sea zone, that player rolls 2 dice. Once all the dice are rolled, total all the results that are 3 or less. This is the amount of IPC deducted from collect income. However, damage cannot exceed the production value of the owned adjacent territories. So there is a limit. Therefore, players need to be aware of convoy disruption and protect their coastlines. Convoy disruption is also in effect on the Pacific side of the board. The rules are the same, I've just shown them separately so it's easier to see the zones that are affected. Now let's discuss other rules that will come up during gameplay. Inevitably, during the course of a game, a nation's capital is going to be occupied by the enemy. After a successful invasion of the capital, the occupier collects all of that nation's IPCs. The original owner is still in the game, but they cannot collect income or buy new units. Any remaining units in unconquered regions can still fight on as a sort of resistance. If that conquered nation's capital territory is liberated, either by that nation's resistance forces or the nation's allies, then that player regains control of their forces and plays again as normal. This additional rule is regarding the Soviet-Mongolian Defense Pact. Due to their mutual border conflict with Japan in 1939, the Soviet Union and Mongolia have a special relationship. The Mongolian territories, marked in the board here in white, will never become pro-Axis unless one or more of them is attacked by the Soviet Union. Also, if Japan attacks any Soviet-controlled territory that is adjacent to any Mongolian territory, all Mongolian territories that are still strict neutral or pro-Allies, or have joined the Allies as a result of a failed Japanese attack, will be placed under the control of the Soviet Union at the end of Japan's conduct combat phase. This will occur regardless of the state of relations between the Soviet Union and Japan at the time of the attack, with one exception. If the Soviet Union has attacked Korea or any Japanese-controlled territory bordering these Mongolian territories, while Mongolia was a strict neutral, Mongolia will remain neutral and not ally itself with the Soviet Union. Therefore, Mongolia's sympathies to the war can be a little complicated. This rule is for the US player regarding their economy. When the industrial complexes in the eastern, central, and western United States begin in the game, they are minor industrial complexes. However, once the United States enters a state of war, these industrial complexes immediately upgrade to major industrial complexes at no cost. Let's talk about the rules for playing China. One of the 3 allied players will control China during the game, but it is played as an independent nation, and its resources cannot be mixed with the other players. When the game begins, Japan is only at war with China, and some Chinese territories are already under Japanese control. To complicate matters even further, China is also in the middle of a civil war. Therefore, China's actions are restricted to territories with the Chinese emblem, and the territory of Kwangtung and Burma. Due to all this, China is also not subject to convoy disruptions. Unlike other powers in the game, China is not an industrialized nation, has a rural economy, and a decentralized government. As a result, China does not have a capital, so even if Japan controls all of Chinese territories, they are not out of the game. China holds its unspent IPCs and waits for liberation. China may only spend its IPCs initially to purchase infantry units. These units can be mobilized in any Chinese territory under Chinese control. 2 exceptions to Chinese armament: if the Burma Road is open, in other words, the Allies have control of the territories of India, Burma, Yunnan, and Sichuan, then China can purchase artillery units. The second exception is that at the beginning of the game, China has 1 fighter. This represents the American volunteer group, the Flying Tigers. This fighter cannot leave China, and if it is eliminated, it cannot be replaced. Keep these rules in mind when managing China in the game. Now you should know enough for you and your game group to begin a game of Axis and Allies Global 1940. Questions about this game, requests for future Harsh Rules game tutorials, and constructive feedback are all greatly appreciated. Drop a line in the comments section. To be the first notified when this episode and any Harsh Rules episode is placed online, please subscribe to this channel. Until then, I'm Ben Harsh for Harsh Rules. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you on the next episode.